Raise your hand if you are data literate. I know I can't see you, but I'm going to imagine that all of you raised your hands. Let's talk data expert to data expert about our own data literacy. Hello, my name is Laura Ludwig, and together we're going to take a fresh look in the mirror to uncover some places where we can grow our skills. Before we do, let's get on the same page about what data literacy even means. Think for a moment about how you define that term. Have one in mind? Good. The official definition that we're going to work from is the ability to read, understand, create, and communicate data as information. Data as information, that's a great definition. We're going to expand upon it. Let's get out of our data bubble for a minute. I'd like you to think about a child in primary school. Perhaps it's your own child or a niece or nephew. Maybe it's you as a child. Now think about their primary language. Can that child read a storybook? Can they write a short story? Now, based on the verbs from our definition, that child can read, can understand, can create, and can communicate using words. So we're done, right? That child is literate. I think most of us would agree that there's still a lot for that child to learn before they can read the greats like Colson Whitehead, Virginia Woolf, or even J.K. Rowling. And that's just to get them to read and understand those authors, not to mention writing like one. So it might be considered reasonable to visualize that child's literacy as a continuum. A child goes from learning the actual ABCs in primary school to experiencing a variety of literature through secondary school. At this point, the child, now young adult, might decide to major in literature at university and start doing some research. If they end up crafting an award-winning book, we might consider this the pinnacle of literacy, as they've mastered all of the components of their craft. This seems like a valid mental model. Let's see if it applies to data literacy. The equivalent of the ABCs for data literacy would be something as simple as using graphs. This level of data literacy would apply to many people at our organizations: sales, marketing, finance, operations. Within those groups, we might also have some people who are particularly savvy with data. These are the people who might be able to configure a dashboard in a self-service tool if they're given a good data source. Beyond that, we have people who work with data all the time. So these are people who are writing advanced queries and building data products for others, and all the way up to tuning machine learning models and algorithms. The problem I have with this model is that it only accounts for technical expertise. In our definition, that would equate to being able to read and create. But what about understand and communicate? Those aren't tied to technical skills. Let's add a second dimension to our model to try to solve this. Now, our previous spectrum is called data competency, which roughly equates to technical skills of working with data, the reading and creating component of our definition. The second dimension is called insight translation. This is the process of understanding the data and putting it to use in some way. This axis relies heavily on understanding and communicating components of our definition. Let's switch to thinking about the typical user who might operate at these different technical levels. As we consider what insight translation is, it seems reasonable to assume that the people who are closest to the business actions need the highest level of insight translation capability. As a sales manager, they might need to translate a graph about sales this quarter into tactical actions to reach their quota. The sales power user might provide more data and a more nuanced answer to questions around which regions need additional support this quarter. A data analyst might be asked to evaluate whether those regions all have similar characteristics that explain the lower performance. And a data scientist might be asked to predict which regions are going to need more support next quarter based on what we know about historical performance. These insights from the more technical roles have to go up the chain to the manager in order to actually be acted upon and engage with the regional sales team to help make those sales quotas. There are different amounts of insight translation that different roles can and should do. We shouldn't all be at the same level. Companies want to be data-driven. We don't have to look far to see an article about that. Many companies focus on building the technical skills, and while that's important, having the people who can do the more technical things is important. It's the insight translation that makes the magic happen. I would currently place many of us in our various roles as ranking pretty low on the insight translation piece. I think we've got a lot that we can learn here. And if we can do that for ourselves as data experts, we can help our business counterparts do the same. That's what we're going to focus on for the rest of our time together, building insight translation skills for us as data experts. So remember that child from a few minutes ago that when we tried to check off the boxes, it did not help us in concluding that the child was literate? Well, how should we be evaluating for literacy if we can't rely on a list? Well, we're going to do it by looking at key behaviors and attitudes. An easy way to think about key behaviors is to frame it in this way. As a data literate person, you, and then fill in the blank. We're going to look at 8 of these in detail. As we go through, I want you to assess yourself. Go ahead and grab a piece of paper and a pen and draw a copy of this octagon for yourself. As I describe each behavior, reflect on your own skill level and give yourself a score, 1 to 10. A 1 is, I've never heard of this before, and a 10 is, I do this consistently without thinking about it. Then think about where you need to be as part of your own role. Write that down and draw a little arrow, something like this, and keep track for yourself. You ready? Let's go ahead and dive in. As a data literate person, you work independently with data. Being independent with something means you're comfortable working with it on your own. You don't need someone prescribing exactly what an output should look like or what steps to take to reach a conclusion. You can clean your data and formulate your data to fit your output product appropriately without needing to rely on others to do that work. That's not to say you're a lone wolf. Having the ability to do it is not the same as always doing it. You may work in a team and have a specific set of things that you are responsible for in a given project, but you also have to know the rest of the data lifecycle so that you can speak accurately about the tasks that surround your own. As a data literate person, you collaborate to define problems. When working with a new analysis question, you discern what type of output is going to move the needle to answer that question. To do that, you have to know a little bit about the data that's available. You have to ask relevant questions about the analysis use case, and then suggest ideas for what output could be. This is going to be different depending on how well defined the question is that you're presented with. Sometimes problems are broadly defined when they come across your desk, and you've got to whittle them down into a concrete question that can be answered with data. Other times, questions are far too focused and they miss a bigger picture. So you have to find the right way to open up the scope of the problem so that you can situate a laser-focused question into a bigger picture. As a data literate person, you constantly learn new things. This includes learning about new data domains, new tools, new methods, new algorithms, just to name a few. For us as data experts, the one that might be harder for us is learning new data domains, particularly learning the context of that domain. For example, if you've never worked with clickstream data, there's a lot to learn from a technical perspective about how it's structured and what it logs, but there's also a significant amount of context to learn. What business process created this? Why did it get created? And what kinds of things can we actually do with it? Building skills and techniques to get up to speed on a new data space quickly is imperative for a highly data literate person. You can do this in a number of ways. I like to find videos from industry leaders or read books or blogs on a particular topic, One of my favorite ones is finding a similar data set on Kaggle or data.world that has concrete prompts in a data dictionary to help me translate between what I'm learning about the context and what I know from a technical perspective. Not only do we need to know how to learn something new, but we also need to engage with new learning materials with a purpose. By relating everything back to the problem at hand that we're trying to solve, we can craft insightful questions to learn more from our colleagues who are requesting our help. By getting enough knowledge ahead of time, it makes meetings with key stakeholders all the more productive because they're not spending time teaching you the basics of their business. Instead, the focus can be on the specific implementation of the basics within your organization. As a data literate person, you use technology strategically. Part of learning any new tool well is learning when to apply it. We use the simplest form available to manage the complexity that's necessary based on our data, or at least we should. This means that we don't build an animated chart when a static image will do. This means that we don't build 5 versions of a report when a filter could solve the problem. By keeping an eye on the final solution from the beginning, we make sure that we have the right scope of technical investment at every step in the process. I find for me that this comes up a lot during the exploratory analysis phase of many projects. Because I come from a data visualization background, I end up wasting a lot of time trying to make my EDA visualizations into presentation-worthy plots. Strategic technology use also relates to knowing when to stop an analysis. We know that we need to avoid overfitting our algorithms and that we need to be strategic about when we use our heavy computing resources. We also need to be considerate of the precision that's required to act on the question that we're working to answer. Do we need a directionally correct answer, or is precision required to the hundredths place of our metric in order to make a decision? We should aim for the minimum specificity that's required for making the decision and nothing more. As a data literate person, you adapt your communication styles. You base your communication on the needs of the audience. To do that, you have to know your audience and what they're going to do with the data product you're creating for them. You also have to know how they're going to engage. Do they only want to know when things are going wrong in their business, or do they want to have a regular reminder that things are just fine? Are they the type that's going to go out and refresh a report, or do they need an email popping into their inbox with the highlights? Of course, some of those specifics get accounted for during the solution design process, but being able to anticipate and delight our audience with something that they need in a format that they want is a way to really shine as a data expert. As a data literate person, you exercise empathy for other perspectives. While you're getting to know your audience and what they need, you're exercising empathy. You're considering their perspective to create something that answers the most pressing questions, even if they haven't articulated those questions yet. By stepping into their shoes, you can start to anticipate what the next questions will be once they see the answers to the questions they've already asked. One of the perspectives that we should always apply throughout an analysis is that of the skeptic. We need to recognize that data is not always as objective as we want it to be. There are hidden biases in data stemming from how it's collected, analyzed, and presented. Research questions can have hidden bias as well. We should approach every new data set, every new question with a degree of skepticism. Our aim is to understand why the question is being asked, and if there are other questions that aren't being asked that maybe should be. Bias isn't inherently malicious, and by interrogating our data and our analyses, we can help ensure that we're contributing to a more equitable and truthful understanding of the world. So, how do we know what questions aren't being asked? How do we learn to see through other perspectives? It's all about breadth here. We've got to read widely, we must consume a variety of news and entertainment sources. We must practice getting into other people's heads. When I say read widely, I don't just mean nonfiction or business books. I mean fiction. If the last fiction book you read was in school of some kind, that is your main homework coming away from this talk, is to find a fiction book and commit to reading it before the end of the year. In addition to expanding our perspective by consumption, we need to be expanding our networks to include many different voices. This can be anyone that doesn't look or think like you. PyData is a great way to do exactly that. So you've already made a good choice for your own data literacy by being here today to hear from perspectives around the world. As a data literate person, you comprehend and critique your work and your data. You approach problems with an open and engaged mind, coupled with a discerning attitude. Showing up in this way makes sure that you're willing to kill your darlings. This is a familiar bit of advice given to writers, but it also applies here. It means we have to be willing to throw away something that we've worked on if it's getting in the way of the overall analysis. This might mean that we exclude an interesting but confusing visualization of our data for the sake of clarity. It might mean that we can't do the segmented analysis we planned because we don't have enough data to get the statistical power that we need. It can mean walking away from a particular algorithm because the tuning parameters dictate that you would need more computing power than you have budget for. All of these are examples of killing our darlings in the data world. And finally, as a data literate person, you translate evidence. More than just valuing evidence, you can communicate the strength of your analysis. You know what information is relevant to which people, and you articulate your reasoning clearly and concisely. Knowing what's relevant to people is another part of knowing your audience. You've got to know what evidence they value. Accurately describing the strength of our evidence is one of the most useful things we can do when presenting an analysis. Doing this well means outlining weaknesses clearly. Knowing how to talk about statistical power and error terms with non-data experts is critical, and it takes practice. Often, business users are not going to be interested in the statistics lesson, even if you're exceptionally good at explaining those things. They are only going to care about what conclusions can we be confident about. Learning how to articulate your evidence in terms of business risk and reward will help you share evidence in concrete ways without becoming known as the statistics professor. To recap here, we have 8 key behaviors that we should be aiming for. There are a lot of things to cover here. Take a look at your score sheet. For any segment where you're at least 2 points away from where you think you should be, shade that in real quick. I hope you have at least one, if not many, because next we're going to walk through some methods for building and exercising these behaviors. I want you to keep your octagon handy. Each exercise targets multiple behaviors, and you can quickly reference your needs to figure out which ones are going to give you the most bang for your buck. A word of warning. Many of these behaviors that we've been looking at have nothing to do with our technical skills, which means that some of these are going to fall out of your comfort zone. It may even feel unproductive in the moment that you're doing them. But in trying something new, you're already practicing one of the key behaviors, which is constantly learning new things. Let's start with flexibility in communications. You'll want to pay particular attention here if you have any of the bottom 3 segments filled in, which are adapting learning new things, using technology strategically, and adapting communications. Think about how you typically share information. Maybe you're on Twitter regularly, or if you're an academic, you may share your work in journals. Those 2 examples of communication are on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of length, but they require just as much care in crafting. Why? Well, Twitter requires conciseness. You've got to distill your thoughts into 280 characters or chunks of 280 characters if you're going to do a thread. On the other end, when writing something longer, you have to craft a strong argument with a thoughtful structure and clear logic, providing evidence that supports your claims. This requires a lot of attention to detail. When things get really interesting is when you start flexing your muscles to take one type of message and put it into another form. Like taking a tweet and making it into a paper, or taking a paper and turning it into a tweet. and all of the different levels in between, which include emails and blog posts and all sorts of other articles. I like to call this communications yoga. Take a small fact, build a story, or take a story and turn it into a few sentences. There are a lot of ways to do this. The first and most important part is to intentionally get away from your usual communications tool. Do you always build PowerPoint slides to share your findings? Instead, try building a storyline with a tool like Flourish or Tableau. You could also try adopting the Amazon model, which is to write out a briefing memo for everyone to read in the first few minutes of a meeting, and let your words and documentation present your argument and what you've found. Even if you don't end up using this new material for a meeting, the process of getting out of your usual methods is valuable. And you should try running meetings a little bit differently. Nobody likes the same boring structure all the time. One of my favorite ways of getting clear on my messages is what I call the Post-it note distillation. Check your octagon. If you've got adapting communication, critiquing data and work, working independently with data, or collaborating to define a problem, you should try this with your next analysis. The objective of this activity is to summarize the main questions and key insights of an analysis onto a Post-it note. By restricting the real estate of your communication to a 3-inch square piece of paper, you're forced to write down only the most important things. I like to do this with my visualizations too. If I can't draw a skeleton graph of my key analysis outputs, I'm not just done distilling my key information. This often leads to asking more probing questions about the desired outcome. It's often really helpful to do this at the beginning phases of a project because it helps everyone get on the same page about what is most important, both on the team and with customers. An advanced version of the Post-it note exercise is to rely entirely on words, specifically the 1,000 most common words of your language. This idea was inspired by a book called Thing Explainer by Randall Munroe. If you're not familiar, he draws the webcomics XKCD and has written a number of books. In Thing Explainer, he uses only the 1,000 most common English words to explain how things like nuclear reactors and rockets work. He uses simple words in greater number to describe things. For example, nuclear becomes hard to find heavy metal. But his intent is still clear and understandable to anyone, even if they don't know the technical vocabulary. In the data space, we might have an analysis that required us to impute some of our data. Instead of talking about imputation methods, we might say something like how we filled in the empty spaces with good guesses. This clarity of idea is what we're aiming to develop. Once we can do that, we can add technical terms back in if it is going to help us be more concise, but only if it makes sense for our audience. On the other end of the communication spectrum, we have what I like to call the tough Q&A. Take a peek at your octagon. If you're looking to build empathy for other perspectives, critique your work and data, and translate evidence, this activity is for you. With this exercise, we want to build flexibility and confidence with communicating our insights. Here's how we do this. First, build a list of questions that you may get about a data product. You might already have a good list of questions based on things you've been asked previously. This list should include things about the data, the source, the quality, the frequency, and the methodology, the cleaning, the analysis methods, the sources of error. Next, put on your investigative journalist hat and get really skeptical. Elaborate your questions. The more difficult or obscure the questions are, the better. Try to twist your own work around, considering how someone with a different background might misinterpret your choices. Once you have your list, your next task is to hunt down and document the answers to these questions. This process is going to do two things. One, it's going to highlight the places in your analysis where you need to apply more rigor or remove some bias. And two, it prepares you to go into deeper detail at a moment's notice. Pairing this exercise with a distillation exercise also give you a ton of flexibility in talking about the output of your analysis. The final skill building activity I want to talk about is something I'm calling practice class. If you've got independence with data, collaboration on defining problems, learning new things, or exercising empathy shaded in, you'll want to host yourself one of these. This concept stems from masterclass, where a person shares their expertise with others who want to learn about a concept. In this version, the goal is to practice being a beginner at something. It can often be hard to remember what it was like to be a beginner, and it can sometimes feel intimidating to willingly be new to something and ask the most basic questions. So how do we do this? Start by forming a small group of colleagues with a wide array of interests. It shouldn't be particularly formal. Something like a lunch gathering once a week would be a great place to start. Each person picks something that they are an expert in. An ideal topic is something you can explain without much preparation, is interesting to learn about, and most importantly, is non-work related. Examples include things like how to make the best guacamole, or starting a bullet journal, or how to find the best travel deals. Each week, one person talks for 15 minutes about their selected topic. The remaining time is used for people to ask questions of the presenter and exercise their curiosity. The goal is to fill at least 15 more minutes with discussion based on questions that students ask. There are only 2 rules for a practice class. First, the presenter can't use slides. This rule prevents over-preparing and keeps the gatherings casual. Props or a visual aid that's printed out can be used, but try to keep everything as simple as possible. The second rule is that students are not allowed to use Google or any other search engine to look anything up. Instead, all questions must go to the presenter. This reinforces the acceptability of being a novice, as well as helps the entire group be curious together. One of my favorite quotes comes from Helen McInnes: "Nothing is interesting unless you're interested." By engaging with the expert in your group on whatever they presented, you help everyone be more curious. We've covered 8 key behaviors and 4 skill building exercises. You've got a self-made plan on where you need to grow your capabilities. I now have 2 challenges for you. The first one is this: in 2021, commit to advancing your skill level from where it is now to your personal target in at least 2 of these behaviors. Why 2? I think you're going to find it's more challenging to move just one, so may as well go big. The second challenge, you may have already seen this one coming because I alluded to it earlier. Read a new book before the end of 2020. I have a few recommendations for you if you need some inspiration. Some of these are fiction, some are nonfiction. Don't worry about reading all these small covers. You can check out that link where I've got 2 lists on Goodreads that you can use to find a good recommendation for what you want to read for the end of this year. Finally, I want this to mark the beginning of a conversation. I want to connect with you. I'd love to hear how you're building your insight translation skills and your data competency skills too. I am, after all, a data expert like you. I love hearing about cool projects and how data is making the world better. You can find me on social media at the links listed here, or drop me an email. Let me know what you want to hear more about and how I can help you. Thank you.